Green.
Yeah.
That's okay. Just pause it.
I don't know how. Oh.
Yeah.
Everything's in a different spot.
Yeah.
Great. So welcome Laura from Community Employment Services. I'm just gonna go back to your PowerPoint here. And we're having a conversation. Whoop, where are you? With a job developer. No, we're.
Over to the right.
There
Yeah.
There we go.
Come on. There we go.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Laura.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure. I'm not a formal person. I said that to Tamara when we started talking about planning this. I'm pretty informal. So when it was promoted as a conversation, that really is what it is. I am going to present a little bit about who I am, what Loyalist CES does, and some of the offerings for employers in Employment Ontario. But I also want to have a conversation about hiring, training, retention in the area. And I'm going to throw it some hot takes and some observations in that sort of more locally as well on that topic. So welcome and thank you so much for coming. So a brief overview of what we're talking about. So I am going to introduce myself as well as Loyalist CES. Don't worry, it's not a sales pitch about what we can offer, but just to sort of explain what we do and also so you walk away with a pretty good idea of what an Employment Ontario office can do for you and your business.
Well, it can't be a sales pitch because you guys are funded by the government, right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So I am going to talk about the employer services provided by CES. I will mention all of our services as well too, because I think that is important. What I do specifically is employer point of contact though. And again, talking about hiring and recruitment post-pandemic. I use post-pandemic carefully though, because there is a lot that is still going on that we're still in it, I think, with some of the concerns and challenges going on, and questions and answers, and really just general discussion. So pretty straightforward. So who is Loyalist CES? So we are part of the college. So I am a Loyalist College employee, but we are not located on campus. So we're located at 54 Dundas Street East, close to downtown between Pinnacle and Church. We deliver Employment Ontario programs, and our main mandate is to offer support to job seekers and employers. So sometimes we'll get the question, why aren't you located on campus? My best answer for that is you don't have to be associated to Loyalist to use our services. So anyone in the community can walk in. You don't have to be a Loyalist student or alumni, but we are under the Loyalist umbrella, and we certainly work closely with our colleagues at Loyalist. So that's where we are, and I am going to talk a little bit more about the programs that we offer. So I'm going to get into what we offer specifically for employers. But we do offer services for job seekers, and sometimes it's good for employers to know what people experience when they walk through the door as a job seeker. So for job seekers, we have a resource center. It's, again, we're government funded, so all of our services and support are free to access for job seekers and employers. So the resource center, people can pop in, utilize computers, photocopies of their resume. There's always a staff member there to serve as support if they need help. A lot of people have home offices or space at home that they're comfortable in doing job search from, but I sometimes say sometimes it's nice just to have a change of scenery. So people are always welcome in a resource center. You do not need an appointment. There's also one-to-one employment counseling. So at our office, we have 4 employment consultants, and they meet with people one-to-one. Now that usually does require an appointment. Sometimes a walk-in meeting is available as well. But there is sort of more of that specialized, personalized service. With employment counseling, sometimes it can be career exploration and job search support. we meet with such a huge cross section of people. Sometimes it's someone who's been suddenly laid off from a career that they've worked in for 30 years. Sometimes it might be a very, very new grad who's looking to get into their field of training. It really runs the gamut. And oftentimes when people come through our door, they're at a bit of a crossroads and they're not exactly sure where to go. So that's sometimes where the career exploration can come into. Workshops, we've tried to maintain the flexibility of virtual and in person coming out of the pandemic. So the workshops run the gamut. I recently did one like an apprenticeship 101 workshop. We sometimes offer interview prep, career exploration, employer expectations. We also like to get feedback from people, like if there's something that they would like to see in a workshop, we're happy to offer it. That's usually based on numbers and that kind of thing. Another big thing that we do for job seekers is access to retraining programs. So there used to be something called Second Career, which is now called Better Jobs Ontario. So for someone who has maybe been out of the labor market for a little while, or maybe laid off, and again, maybe looking at a career change or upskilling, we would encourage them to come in and have a conversation with us about exploring what options might be available. And that might be Better Jobs Ontario. Job matching and placement, that's a big part of what I do. So when we're working with job seekers, the other clients that we have are also employers, and a lot of them are small businesses. So we can sometimes make matches and sometimes offer a placement and with training incentives, which I'm going to get into in the next couple of slides. And we also do referrals to other relevant community resources. So oftentimes when somebody comes through our doors, employment isn't the only thing that they might need support for. So we want to make sure if someone maybe needs support for housing or mental health, or even upgrading for their high school diploma, we try to make those connections for people. So for employers, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on all of these things, but as an overview, I don't know whether this is good news or bad news, but I am the only job developer at Loyalist CES. So if you're an employer contacting us, you get to talk to me. For employers, we have a few services. So we have job posting services, which again, I'll go into a bit more detail about. We have pre-screening assistance. We also have the ability to host job fairs or other recruitment events. And we can even offer space for interviews. I mention that because it doesn't happen a lot, but because a lot of our employers that we work with are small businesses, sometimes they don't have brick and mortar space. Sometimes they don't necessarily want to do interviews on their site. I always say 99% of the time we'll have space for you. So let me know if you do need that space. We're happy to accommodate. And we also can offer support for interviewing and onboarding. Again, that depends on what the employer needs and prefers, but that's also available. And there's also training incentives for eligible candidates, which I'll again chat a little bit more in detail about. So job posting services, there's a lot of ways that employers can post jobs. Obviously, Indeed is a big one these days, but I always encourage people to use our job posting services. Again, it's free of charge. Postings go on our website, loyalistces.ca. All jobs that we post and share also go on our social media platforms. Depending on employer preference, and that's usually a conversation that you would have with me, I try to find out what you're looking for and how you would like people to apply to you. So a lot of employers just want applicants to apply direct. That is totally fine. If you would prefer for applicants to go to me first, I'm also happy to do that. So what happens is the contact information for resumes goes to my email address, and depending on the employer preference, we can do some pre-screen, which I'll talk about in the next slide.
So very individualized.
Very individualized. So I like to have that conversation to find out what the employer is preferring. Some particularly small businesses prefer to keep their identity confidential in the posting. That's probably less common now, but when that happens, that's totally fine. It would get posted as such. It would get posted under Loyalist CES, and resumes would come to me.
Thank you.
So if I'm talking to an employer and they're saying, you know what, Laura, I'd really like some help with pre-screening applicants. I don't know how many applicants I'm going to get, but I'd like for you guys to go through them first. So these are just some key considerations I have, and these are usually questions that I would have for the employer in that conversation. So I like to try to find out what are the requirements versus the preferences. Because sometimes that goes beyond what's in the job posting. There's sometimes some of that off the record information that's good for me to know as well. Do you have any specific pre-screen questions? There's been some employers that I work with that would like us to ask very specific questions, which again is fine if those are the parameters that you're looking for. I also like to find out, I'm an optimist, or I try to be, but I also want to find out, are there any deal breakers? Because let's face it, I don't want to waste anybody's time. I don't want to waste
someone up to fail, right?
I don't want to waste an applicant's time or my employer's time. So are there any deal breakers that would really prevent the person from moving on in the process? My ultimate goal in the pre-screen services is to help you save time. How the pre-screen looks like is very individual to the employer. Sometimes I'll have employers say, can you have all the resumes go to you and maybe just take a quick look through and then forward me some of the top ones. Others want more of a conversation with the person as well. Again, that's a conversation I usually try to have with the employer to find out what the preferences are. I'm going to talk a little bit about training incentives. I tried to make it really brief only because it's very individualized. And it's probably no surprise to anyone in this room or online, government programs change. So I'm always a little bit tentative about throwing out amounts and things like that, because throughout the years, programs change, parameters change. This is a general summary. So there, in a case where we might have a job seeker that we can offer an employer a training incentive for. A training incentive is sort of the newer word that they're using for a wage subsidy. It's a partial wage subsidy. It depends on employer eligibility and candidate eligibility. So both have to be eligible. Eligibility for both have to be determined before the person starts. So if someone contacts me and says, you know what, I've hired somebody on, they've been with me for 3 months, can I get any funding? Unfortunately, no. Okay. Our mandate is to help job seekers get into roles. So it has to be at the point of hire. On the funding offsets some of the wages for the first few weeks. So I say that because it doesn't replace all of the wages. The employer still has to put the person on payroll, provide WSIB or equivalent, and third-party liability insurance.
That's a great point.
Yeah, so
if you already have third-party liability insurance as the nature of your business, that would automatically.
absolutely. I didn't bring it today and I didn't include it here, but I can certainly send it to anybody who's interested. There's an employer registration form that if any business is working with us, we get you to fill that out. And it's the first half of it is more or less just your general business information. And so for WSIB and third-party liability insurance, it asks if you have it. I don't need the numbers. I don't want copies of it or anything like that, but you just have, you have to declare that you do have it. You can't be displacing an existing employee. So another question on that form is your company involved in any layoffs? If the answer is yes, then unfortunately we can't be replacing new people with funding to replace a laid off employee. There has to be evidence that there's on the job training. So I would argue I haven't come across that too much where I can't make a rationale that there isn't some kind of on the job training depending on the person. But if somebody happens to be very, very experienced in the exact same role for a very similar company, it's going to be awfully hard for me to make that rationale. And again, with programs, some programs that we have had in the past are a bit more restrictive and some aren't. Yeah,
So if I'm looking at, can I give an example?
sure.
So I'm looking at somebody who's immigrated here,
Mhm,
has her RN from the other country,
mhm.
is not accepted as an RN here
Mhm.
or RPN
Yep.
here. And I want to provide her with training in my business as a PSW.
That,
Would that be iffy? But, because she's foreign trained, I don't know what her skill sets are. I still want her to go through, like we have probably 20 hours of online
mhm.
work before they even put their feet on the floor with clients.
I think there could be something there. And again, I'd have to probably know more details.
Yeah.
But one of the things that is also considered, and I should have mentioned it there, again, I was trying to keep it really a brief summary. But if someone's education or training is outside of Canada, that's also one of the questions that's asked, and that's something that can be considered. So if there is that rationale that they would be learning some different or some additional skills. The only thing that I would say too is to be aware of is in Employment Ontario, we can only register job seekers. And when I say register job seekers, that basically means we have to be able to register a job seeker to offer funding. They have to be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. If someone is on a visitor visa, it's difficult. So again, I would probably say there would be some conversations, maybe just to make sure that would work. So funding varies in duration and amounts depending on eligibility. And when I say the eligibility, it's the employer and the new hire, but it's also programs. So right now we have a program called Youth Job Connection, and it's been around for a few years. It is geared to helping barriered youth. And often those barriered youth have no post-secondary. Sometimes they haven't completed high school. There's usually some other stuff going on. And typically they have zero employment experience. With that program, that's an example of, I usually have more resources, AKA money, to be able to offer an employer. But there's good reason for that. They often don't have experience or skills. And again, I'm really summarizing this because I also kind of think let's face it, it gets boring. But if there is a scenario where an employer is hiring someone through our program and we're able to offer some training incentives for them, again, big surprise, government programs, they have a form for everything. So all parties, so you, the new hire, the employer, we all sign a training agreement. I like to emphasize agreements because it's not a contract. People aren't tied into anything. You as the employer, it's like any other employee you've ever hired on, and the rights and responsibilities are the same. For the new hire, I explain the same thing. You're still getting paid through the employer. You're still an employee of that business. The only difference is in those first few weeks when we're assisting with wage incentives and kind of supporting and checking in, I just want to know if anything changes. I need to be aware of any concerns. And let's face it, I like to hear the good stuff too. So again, I'm not a formal person. So oftentimes my checking in is maybe a quick email or a quick phone call to see how things are going. But in that period of time, and afterwards as well. I do like to know how things are going, for sure.
And if it's not going well, and say it's a week into it and it's not going well,
Happens.
then will the funds still be allocated even if it's not completed?
Yes, as long as everything's been signed. And that's also a big part of why we want to make sure that everything is eligible to move ahead, if that makes sense. That I have all the information before anyone starts. Certainly that happens. I mean, life happens. Sometimes you don't realize someone's not a good fit until they get into the job. And on the other flip side of that too, sometimes people start jobs and go, I don't think this is a good fit, or maybe there's other life circumstances that have changed. And again, that's where I'd say it's an agreement, it's not a contract. The only thing where I'll say you'll get on my bad side is if nobody tells me, or I do, because I have to know, right? So just let me know if there are problems that you think you as the employer want advice on, or if it's something that I can support an employer in, that's also what I'm here for too. I'm certainly not somebody who's ever gonna, tell anybody how to run their business. But I have had sometimes employers say, this is what's going on with this person. Do you have some advice? And I'll offer it if I have it. Sometimes I go, I have no idea. I'm not afraid to say that either.
Well, like you said, everything's individual,
Yep.
right?
Oh, for sure.
And I love your word, life circumstances, because it does happen in business and in our personal, for sure.
And we're dealing with people, right?
People,
I mean, employers are human, the job seekers and new hires are human, so a lot of things can happen. So I also wanted to mention the Canada Ontario Job Grant. It's been around for a few years. When it came out, it was actually different than any other program that we had in our offerings before. And why it was different is our main mandate is hiring and new hires and kind of that initial on the job training. Canada Ontario Job Grant was different because it's also geared to companies with their existing workforce. So I'm going to do a very quick summary of this. I don't actually process these COJG applications directly, but these are the meat and potatoes. So it's geared to companies who want to provide existing training to their existing workforce. Employers can get up to $10,000 per person for training costs. The training has to be delivered by an eligible third-party trainer. So unlike the training incentive through the work that I do, it's not a wage incentive. It's not on the job training. This is where you've identified a course or a program through a third-party trainer. Maybe it's Loyalist, maybe it's another trainer. And the spirit behind it, the rationale behind it is that you're able to demonstrate that training is going to help advance or upskill your current staff. Employers have to contribute and to the cost of the training, and the percentage depends on the size of the company. So bigger companies do have to make a bigger contribution. Smaller companies, it's a bit less. Again, I didn't want to go into a lot of detail. My colleague Nicole does deal with COJG directly. So I would, when I'm talking to an employer, and if they're giving a scenario where it's something that I think could fall under COJG, I make sure that they're connected with her.
Perfect.
Again, with similar to a lot of our other stuff, the application has to be submitted before the training starts. So if an employer is already paid for training and it's already set up, we can't do anything. And the reason for that is our funders would say, well, the company intended to do it anyway without us. Any questions about COJG? I may not know the answer.
Okay, yeah.
Well, actually, in the workshop recap, I can give also Nicole's contact
Sure.
information too, eh?
Sure. And there is
And your website probably.
yeah.
Like standard first aid training.
So no,
Okay,
yeah. So
it would be upskilling, so it might be something like adding to their current knowledge and skill.
Yes.
So you would want to,
The things that aren't covered, so I'm glad you asked that, because first aid CPR isn't, I'll give another example, working at heights. If it's something that like would normally be on the employer to provide for that employee to work, and it particularly health and safety related, I'm gonna say, that wouldn't be something that would be
Okay.
covered, because that would be still something that should be offered by the employer, if that makes sense.
yes.
Okay.
It's part of the onboarding process, right? Yeah.
So I'm just gonna go back. So that's sort of the encompassing Loyalist CES Laura part of it, I guess. Does anybody have any questions about what our office does, or, and we can talk afterwards too?
If you're gonna talk more about job fairs. I'd like
Oh,
to
there's a
hear-
job fair coming up here at Loyalist.
Part-time job fair.
Yeah.
So yeah,
September.
absolutely. Yeah. Awesome.
We are working on it. We got 4 employers already signed up.
Great.
But still, we are figuring it out which location would be best because there are lots of construction going on. So we are figuring out what location could be the right one. We were expecting it's going to be the fitness, like the basketball thing, but I
Right.
think that would be not a good option.
Great.
That they are closing the front area, so it would be really hard for employers to come in.
Yeah.
Hi,
Yeah.
you're
So-
building right here,
Oh, okay,
all those classrooms.
like they did it at the link launch last year.
Yeah,
So I think that.
That
would be
worked out
a
well,
good
actually.
option, I guess, yeah.
we had over, I think if I remember correctly, Luke, we had over 113 people actually approach and talk to us
Oh, okay.
during that fair. That was
Good,
pretty
yeah.
amazing. And when Luke had quite a few people call and say like, hi, I'm in the program, I met you at the job fair and I'd like to have a small business, especially for summer, right? Like the
Yeah.
part-time, direction.
Yeah.
And got connected with Luke, the business consultant, to be able to go
Good.
forward.
Yeah, for job fairs, we certainly, again, when I'm talking to an employer, if there is an event going on at main campus, we definitely want to make that connection. And I will say too, because we are part of Loyalist, when I'm talking to an employer, and it also makes sense for them to connect with career services, whether it's a job fair, whether it's posting, maybe it's something that could be an internship opportunity or something like that, I make sure that they connect with my colleagues, right? Because I think that, again, we're part of Loyalist, but we don't work with students. I mean, we can, for sure, we can on certain levels. But if an employer is really looking for current students or recent grads, of course, we're also going to make sure that they connect with their services. Yeah, absolutely. It's not to say that we couldn't post jobs, but it's same thing, I guess, with job fairs as well. I mean, I've said to employers, if you're looking for the student population, connect with career services
sure.
because they're going to have events right on campus. You want to go where the students are. The job fairs that we've been involved with, we are a sponsor and we're involved with the 2 city ones. So there's usually one in the fall and one in the spring. Those are the big ones in the area. It's usually up at the Health and Wellness Center. So we're not involved with registering employers for that, but we certainly make sure that they have the information to get registered. For job fairs, we can do some on site for employers. I'm always open for trying different things. So we've done ones where we had healthcare focus, where there was different employers and also different training providers there, with just information about doing PSW programs and things like that. So that was something that we did actually before the pandemic. We also do ones that can be very employer focused. So last week, no, maybe 2 weeks ago, we had a job fair for care partners on site. People could drop in. There didn't have to be an appointment. People could drop in, have an on the spot interview. I'm doing an off-site job fair tomorrow at JBS. And again, we're sort of helping just kind of facilitate that. It can be really flexible. What I will say is in-person job fair events, I try to manage expectations because we don't know what the turnout's going to be. These are the times.
Right.
So we try different things depending on your needs and what you're looking for. I will give you my humble opinion of what I think would be successful. And we have tried different things. The other thing that I've sometimes done, and it's actually, again, depending on the employer and comfort level, if you wanted to even do an info session and just, again, to kind of come in and have a chat about what your company does, or even a general chat about getting into the occupation or getting into the field that you work in, that could also be something that you might want to entertain. So we're flexible, and we certainly would try to accommodate something that would work for you for sure. So I also wanted to kind of just talk about recruitment and hiring trends in general, but I'm also going to be a little bit specific to the Quinte area because that's the area that we live and work in, and that's probably the area that you're hiring in as well. So it was funny, as I was preparing for this presentation, I got an email. It was just like a general email from the Labor Market Commission, and these two stats stuck out at me, so I thought I'd throw them in. I gave it credit, but the stat was 36.9% of employers in Ontario report they're struggling with recruitment, and 27.5% of employers in Ontario report they're struggling with workforce retention. So recruitment and retention still an issue. Those numbers, I don't know. It's interesting because they're high, and I also think it'd be interesting to have a more local number, because I think depending on the sector, I think they could even be higher, perhaps, right? So some recruitment and hiring trends. So this is where I'm going to throw in some Laura Mounsteven hot takes. And you might not agree with me, and that's okay, but I'm also going to say some of it's anecdotal. Some of it is experience and talking to employers and actually seeing kind of what's happening out there.
Well, your boots on the ground, right?
Boots on the ground. So labor market shortages continue. And I know we're talking kind of post-pandemic, but this is what I'm going to say. That was happening even before the pandemic. In 2019, I had way more jobs than people. So when anyone gripes to me about how it's this, and this about hiring, it was happening even before the pandemic. Now, again, I'm no expert in this. What I would say, certainly, I think that the pandemic and a lot of closures magnified, sped up some of the challenges, but it was starting. It was starting to be a very challenging market. Unemployment rates are at a record low, and it's very much a job seekers market. So when I say, like, throughout the years and working in employment services, I've seen both sides. We've had times where I've had tons and tons of job seekers and hearing crickets on the job end, where I'm doing a lot more cold calling. And now the pendulum swung where it's the opposite issue. Recruitment and retention issues in some in-demand fields. I think there's that element in every field, but I'm going to use healthcare as a good example. That's certainly a huge one where there's lots of issues with recruitment. There's lots of issues with retention. A lot of people decided to leave the field too during and after the pandemic. And I'm also going to say virtual work during the pandemic has had lasting effects, good and bad. And I think it depends on perspective. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that too. So some trends and observations that and this is where I would say some of this is just my own observations. So certainly feel free to chime in. I have heard more in the last 3 years than ever. People are looking for work-life balance. And we get it. I mean, we particularly with the pandemic, we all went through something that none of us has ever gone through before. And for some people, they came out of it really looking for that. I've also heard that from employers, to be honest with you as well. So that is a very key component of that. Virtual or remote work can be a viable option for some, and location is no longer a hindrance. So that I think is important for this area as well, because gone are the days that somebody is restricted to looking just in Quinte area. It is totally viable that they could maybe have a position with a company out of the GTA and work from home. So that has an impact on our local labor market. We're seeing more and more people who are looking for part-time or flexible work. Sometimes that's because that's all they want. Sometimes it's for supplemental income. But I'll give the anecdote about the last big job fair in the spring that was at the Health and Wellness Center. And I wasn't the only person that noticed this. Almost every single person that I spoke to was looking for part-time. They were either just looking for part-time, or they were already working and they were, I call it kind of kicking tires, but they were sort of looking for part-time or maybe some supplemental income.
Or even juggling 2 part-times, right? Like,
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah.
I know, like you talk about the work-life balance, like, oh, for, 3 days a week, I'm gonna do this, for 2 days a week, I'm gonna do that. And then I'm using all of my skills and facilities. And
That's right.
the employer looks at it like, well, if you're here part-time, I don't really have to have the coffee machine going. Or I don't really have to pay rent, every day of the week or whatever.
That's right. That's right. So we really noticed that. And that was like, I mean, that was a tangible example because we were hearing it. And then I was going around talking to the employers there. And I don't think I talked to one employer that really was looking for part-time people. So there was a really big gap. So the other thing that we're seeing too is we're seeing a lot of mature workers continuing to work beyond their traditional retirement age. Sometimes that's not by choice. Sometimes they would rather not be working, but I would also say that there is a big majority that are truly, they don't want to retire. They might want to do something different, but they don't want to retire. And the gig economy, that term has been floated around a lot, but it's real. So people with the gig economy, sometimes people started up their own side hustle. Some people started up their own business. Some people are doing contracting out their services.
Subcontractor, yeah.
Subcontracting. That is certainly something that has, I think, again, been magnified and continued on by the pandemic.
It almost, the pandemic kind of gave not a permission, but an invitation to have a side hustle. It's just like, what am I gonna do? Survival mode, resilience kicks in, and it's like, oh, well, if I'm not called back or I need, like there was all these different choices. And I think a lot of people that did have that entrepreneurial spirit picked up on hey, you know what, maybe now's the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've talked to a lot of people that are in that boat. So these are some of my suggested recruitment strategies. I am not trademarking any of these, so feel free to use at your disposal. Use the ones that make sense to you. Here's one of my suggestions: post strategically and utilize all the resources available. And when I say post strategically, sometimes it doesn't make sense to post everywhere. Again, if you contact me and you're asking me where you think you should post, I'm not all about Loyalist yes. Well, I am, but I'm also going to say you're always welcome to post other places. And if your posting makes sense to share on LinkedIn, some don't, but if it's something that makes sense to share on LinkedIn, or maybe there's a professional association that I think, you should, Quinte Home Builders Association or something like that, where you're networking and getting that opportunity out there, you want to be strategic about it. Ensure your company info is available to potential applicants. So I was reminded of that a couple of weeks ago because I was talking to a job seeker who had applied for, it was a construction related position. Well, he was thinking about it, but then he said to me, well, I Googled the company and on Google Maps, it looks just like somebody's house. and I couldn't find any kind of online presence.
Who wants to work there?
So his comment to me, and I get it, he said, that seems sketchy. So I said respectfully, I said, we work with a ton of small businesses, and I would say a lot of them don't have brick and mortar locations. Sometimes in the trades, their address that they're using is out of their home. So on the company side, I'm not saying you have to invest a lot of money into a website or anything like that, but keep that in mind that people are very resourceful.
Mhm.
They're going to Google, and if you do have some kind of a presence on there, I think it's good.
Make it
And-
sharp.
Yeah, I think it's good. And I think too, if your company is fairly new, it's also good for people to be able to find out fairly easily what the company's about. So that's just a suggestion. I don't think it has to be fancy, but a presence is good.
Accurate and update. No, that's a great tip.
So I'm gonna say this to you, and again, if an employer doesn't want to do this, I don't push it, but I'd say my piece. Applicants do not apply to postings without a wage or salary range posted. I'll get some employers that say, I just want to put depends on experience, and what I will say is you may not get a good response.
Yeah.
I think there has to be at least a range. And in my humble opinion, I think that's the only fair thing, is to put a range. If you put a range and say that range depends on experience, great. It gives everybody some flexibility. But I see this all the time. Postings that do not have any kind of range, they don't get a good response. Ensure your posting reflects the position accurately. That almost seems like a no-brainer, but I will say that does happen where I'll get a posting in, and if I have to think, well, I don't really get what this job is, then that's not good. If there's flexibility, make sure that it's clear in the posting. So when I was talking about pre-screen questions and I asked about what's a requirement and what's a preference, if there's things that aren't really a requirement or you might have flexibility on, put it in your posting. So more strategies. Don't be afraid to modify. If you're casting the net out there and you're not getting the applicants that you were hoping to see, change it up. I mean, I say to all of my employers, nothing is set in stone. We can change or tweak or add more detail. Nothing's set in stone. And that's the same with us. That's also the same with any job posting site. Sometimes less is more. Lengthy detail is a turnoff. I have sometimes gotten a 5-page job description for a job posting. No, like if it's a job description and it needs that detail, that's one thing, but a job posting should probably in most cases be pared down. Ensure your posting is reflective of comparable positions in the area. If you're posting for a landscape laborer, it's probably good to be aware of what some of the other positions that are similar to that are in the area, because it also tells you, it might inform you on wage range, but it also can maybe inform you of what you're competing against, because employers are, it's a hot market. Employers are competing for applicants. And consider offering various ways for a candidate to apply. So again, depending on the sector and that, a lot of stuff is by email, some stuff is through, an app. If you can be flexible in that, if there's different ways that you can offer, make it as accessible as possible.
So a mature worker may want to bring in a hard copy resume,
You bet.
may want to fill out an application.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
interesting.
Mhm. Absolutely. And again, if it makes sense for what you're looking for, that you can be flexible, I'd encourage you to do so for sure. So a few other considerations. This first one, I don't want to get on my soapbox, but I will a little bit.
Oh, no, this is a good one.
Don't post unless you're actually hiring. And I say this not to pick on Indeed, but I'll use Indeed as a really good example. So Indeed has a lot of recurring posts from sometimes bigger companies, like nationwide companies. And an example that I ran into in the spring, and it's come up a few more times, is I called a Belleville location of a company that was posting on Indeed, just to try to market a person that I was working with. And he said, you know what, Laura, he's like, corporate office has an account on Indeed that regularly posts. So he says it's out of my control, but I'm actually physically not hiring anyone in Belleville. So, which once we had that conversation, like I totally got it, it was fine. That is something that I think we have to keep in mind, because on the job seeker end of things, we're also seeing the other side of people are getting frustrated. So if there is a company that's posting really regularly, but they're not actually contacting applicants and not actually doing anything, my humble opinion is, I think that's very negative.
Yeah, where's the credibility, right?
Yeah,
Of the
and
company.
yeah, and I know that the reasoning behind it is to have a pool of applicants, but I think it's, again, personal opinion, not the opinion of my employer, but my personal opinion is I think that is a dangerous approach. So my advice is don't post unless you're actually hiring. I mean, not to say that it has to be immediately, but if you're hiring in the near future, for sure, something to keep in mind. Recruitment can take time. So if you maybe know that someone's leaving you and they've given you, 3 months notice or something like this, certainly start the process. It can take time. Who you thought might be your ideal candidate might not be out there. So be open-minded, and most times who you thought was your ideal candidate maybe wasn't necessarily the perfect person. I mean, employers would often give me sort of a wish list, and which is understandable, but it's also good to have some flexibility. And I recently worked with a carpenter who ended up hiring someone who he said, if you hadn't sent him to me, I wouldn't have ever considered him on my own.
Wow.
But it's been such a great fit. So I think that sometimes what our ideal isn't always necessarily the be all and end all.
You may not see on paper
Exactly.
what you would see in person
For sure.
or virtual.
Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah, that's an important thing.
I'm also going to say interviews are overrated. Now, interviews can still be important, but like with the methods of application, I also think that there's some people who are great employees, but stink at interviewing. So, or the opposite. I've also met with people who interview amazingly and not so
Don't
much
come
on the
through.
job.
Yeah.
So what I would say with that is I'm not suggesting to not do interviews, but I'm also suggesting that depending on your business and what your needs are, be creative, be flexible. Maybe there's different ways. I've had some employers who almost like to do like a more informal like coffee chat. It's also what your comfort level is too as the employer.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also going to say be flexible in references, and references can be important. I know some companies are very restricted by that and it's company policy, but I've also seen that there are some really, really good people out there that's been a barrier. That's the barrier for them to get a position. Life happens, companies close, people move on. References can be tricky. So if there is any flexibility on references that you can offer, I would consider it for sure.
On a personal, with references, like I was a business owner. I'm not gonna refer myself, right?
Yeah.
For like 5 years, so it's like, and then my previous career edge was like, oh, well, she's retired now, my supervisor, we haven't worked together for 11 years, that's, so I didn't really have a reference loop, but anyway.
The challenge with references is there's no reference on the reference writer.
Right.
So I don't know what kind of a boss or manager they were and what the interpersonality was like and what else is going on.
Exactly.
Perfect point, perfect.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to talk a little bit about retention, probably a little less about this, but it is certainly a key point. Again, depending on your business, try to develop an onboarding process. And that doesn't always have to be formal and well involved, but it is good to have some kind of process. It ensures adequate training is provided. adjust and adapt. I mean, the results are people staying, or are there service and commonalities? I think that it's good to get feedback and see what's actually happening and make the adjustments that are necessary. And really, communication is key. And I say that on both sides, for employers and employees. You want to create a work culture where a new hire is going to be really comfortable at asking questions. When you ask them, you want them to be comfortable to give you feedback on how the training's going. That's something that I do if it's something that we're supporting through our program. But you want to create that culture where the communication is welcome and reciprocal. So a few more retention strategies: ask for feedback from current staff. Maybe you have staff already. Ask them how they found the training. I mean, if they're still with you, that's a good sign, but I think it's also good to get their feedback. Maybe they'd say, I really wish I had this, and this. That's good to consider. If people are moving on, consider using an exit interview, again, depending on your style and your workplace. It doesn't always have to be formal, but I think it can sometimes help inform future planning for your business if you get some feedback from people who are moving on. And the biggest reason that I hear why people leave positions is they didn't have opportunity to grow or advance. So when you're looking at the overall picture, consider that. And if that's feedback that you're hearing, and if that's something that you can implement with your business, people want that. People don't want to be stagnant. People want to see that there is some room to grow with whatever job that they're in.
Well, just like a business grows,
Yeah.
people want to grow with it.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So that is all.
I'm gonna just stop the recording.
Sure.
And then you guys can have a conversation with her.
Sure.
The firing range begins. I do have a question about some of the programs
Sure.
and with your office though, does it require that it's for trades only? Or that's all employment types?